All right, everybody, welcome back into another Stadium Seat Sports podcast. As always, my name's Coop, here with my partner and co-host Kriv. In this episode, we're going to be chatting about some of the upcoming games here in Week 2, give you our thoughts on them, and kind of what direction each one of us thinks the game is going to go. A little disclaimer here before we get started. I just want to apologize for any audio issues here on my end if it's a little bit grainy. I'm having to record from my cell phone here rather than with the podcast mic. So apologies for this one, but we'll be back to normal with the next episode. But without further ado, Kriv, I'll throw it over to you. First game we're going to start with is going to be number 3 Texas, traveling to the big house up in Ann Arbor to take on number 10 Michigan.
Yeah, so obviously this game is the marquee matchup of the week. The two highest ranked teams meeting. However, I don't know if it's going to live up to the expectations, to be honest. Michigan did not look very promising last week. If anything, they looked very pedestrian. Donovan Edwards, 11 carries, 27 yards. That's just not going to cut it. Michigan's formula that they've relied on the last few years is having a strong run game. And if Donovan Edwards isn't bringing it, that's a huge hit for their offense. Now, they did surprisingly have Mullins, who led them in carries and yards. He looked pretty good. However, in the grand scheme of things, between him and Edwards, the total production wasn't the best. And then, of course, you had the revolving door at quarterback with Orji and Warren. Orji would come in and do some plays to try to boost the run game, or Warren was throwing the ball around, but I think he had like a 50% completion percentage, and that was against Fresno State. Texas is going to be a whole different animal. And yes, Texas did lose some key guys last year, especially on the defensive line, like Devondre Sweat. But Texas is top to bottom loaded. This is a very talented team. And I think the big X factor for me is Quinn Ewers. Just like last year, the early season game where Texas traveled to Alabama, Quinn Ewers played a phenomenal game. He's completing deep balls left and right. If he plays at a high level at this game, I think it's Texas in a runaway. Mainly because I don't believe Michigan has the firepower to keep up. Now, of course, Michigan has a lot of good returning defensive players, but if they can't keep Texas offense kind of contained and keep the score low, they cannot allow this to become a 30, 40-point type outing for Texas. There's no way Michigan's going to keep up there. And for me, at least defensively for Texas, if they focus in on Colston Loveland and try to remove him, which I know is a lot easier said than done, but I do think Texas does have the players that they can actually attempt to slow him down. That dimension of Colston Loveland, he was the entire passing game for Michigan last week. So if you take him out, you make them one-dimensional, you have them run the ball. I like Texas here, and I think it's going to be not particularly close, more than one score for sure.
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a lot of great points, some things that I'm just going to, pretty much hammer on as well. But for me, I mean, the key to this matchup is Texas's QB room versus Michigan's QB room. And Texas's QB room, it strongly favors them. And I know that that's probably not a surprise to pretty much everyone when you have Ewers and Manning in your QB room versus Warren and Orji. But I didn't think that it would be as daunting for Michigan as it appears to be. Warren and Orji were not great last week. They weren't even good last week. I mean, Michigan's offense looked stagnant in all aspects. The run game, as you mentioned, was pretty abysmal, and that's something that Michigan's been built on for years, as a dominating offensive line with some heavy-hitting running backs that are just going to bully you all game. And they couldn't do it against a Fresno State defensive front that is, putting it nicely, very small compared to what they're about to see in Texas this weekend. And something that, I know both of us had thoughts on this, but I don't think I heard you mention it. Texas, with Quinn Ewers, they did it at Alabama last year, as you mentioned, with Ewers having that big game. One of the other things that I, wanted to touch on, and I know you and I both had the same thought, is Michigan trotted out 2 quarterbacks last week. And I know it was 1 week. It was Warren and Orji. But when you have 2 QBs, when you have a 2 QB system, you truly don't have 1 quarterback. And that could be problematic for Michigan in this game. They've got an excellent defense. It's a great defense, bordering on elite. I think it absolutely has the ability to be elite. The Big House is a difficult place to play, but I expect Texas to pull away in this game to a pretty comfortable victory. I do think that, first half will be pretty closely contested, but I would be pretty surprised if Michigan kept this within 10 to 14 points. I would expect Texas to win by that or more. I just don't see how Michigan keeps up offensively with Texas, and Texas has too many weapons and an elite quarterback that they're going to get their points regardless of how good Michigan's defense is, in my opinion. So it looks daunting for Michigan. They're the national champions. It's at the Big House. I'll never fully count them out, but after the performance I saw last week with their offense compared to what Texas is bringing in, I will take Texas in this game, and I will take Texas by a pretty significant margin.
Yeah, I think you hit on all the points, and the rotating door at quarterback against a top 5 team, top 3 even, I think that just spells disaster for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's jump right in here to the next game, and that's going to be Iowa State against number 21 Iowa. If you want to take this one first, feel free. Otherwise, I'll go for it.
Yeah. So, let's be honest here. The only reason this game is being talked about is because it's a rivalry and there's not a lot of ranked matchups going on. This is not a game that you're going to watch and see explosive plays left and right. Neither team has looked like anything you would pretty much not expect. Iowa struggled a bit last week. They did hit a little groove there, but they were playing a inferior opponent anyway. Cade McNamara did show some life, which is promising. And if he's able to do that, I think that kind of separates him from Iowa State. So I think they're pretty even teams. The X factor here, of course, is Cade McNamara making those plays, getting those scores that it seems so hard for Iowa to come by. I do want to call out Noel on Iowa State. He is an X factor as well. He's the kind of guy who can make some plays out there, catching the ball. So if he gets an opportunity and gets lucky and makes a big play or big touchdown score, explosive plays, that's the equalizer for Iowa State in this matchup. But if he's not able to do that, then I expect Iowa to win in a close one.
Yeah, I think you made some good points. I'm gonna have a slight disagreement at the end in terms of my pick. I thought Iowa had a pretty solid offensive production last week, especially for them. Now, granted, I think it started out quite slowly there in the first half. I can't remember if they were up by like 6 or 9 going into halftime. They scored like 14 in the third quarter and 21 in the fourth quarter to ultimately end up winning. I think it was 40-0 last week. But I was impressed overall with Cade's poise and composure in leading this Iowa team. Like his QBR wasn't anything to speak about. I think it was under 60. It was like 58.4 or something right around that mark. But at the same point in time, Iowa scoring 40 points. Yes, I know it was against very inferior competition, but this is an Iowa team that's built on defense, and their defense looks great once again. But an Iowa team that can even put up like relatively average numbers offensively could be a really dangerous team because that defense is always going to be elite. And before I get into my next point here and just kind of quickly wrap up this game, just a question not only for you, but for any of our listeners and viewers. Cade McNamara used to be the quarterback at Michigan. If Cade McNamara was at Michigan, do you think he would be the starter? Would he be over Warren and Orji right now? Because I think he probably would. Like, absolutely. I think he probably would. So, that's something to potentially think about. I'm not saying he ends up being better than those guys overall. I know those guys just had their first starts, but Michigan's offense probably looked a lot better last week if they had Cade McNamara at quarterback. So just something to think about.
Obviously, just going off topic here real quick, but they lost him because of JJ, and they won a national championship. So
sure. Absolutely.
For them. Yes, exactly. It was a trade-off, but I think they take that every time.
No, absolutely, as they should. But no, I think ultimately before closing this game out, I think it's going to be a closely contested game. As you mentioned, it's a rivalry game, so anything can happen in a rivalry game. I think it's going to be hard fought. It's likely going to be a defensive battle, as you would expect with Iowa and Iowa State. Truthfully, I'm slightly leaning Iowa State in this one, but ultimately I could see it going either way. Like I thought Iowa State, I don't think we mentioned it in any of our previous videos, but I thought that they were a sleeper team in the Big 12. I still do. I think Iowa could absolutely win this game, but I'm slightly leaning Iowa State. So we're having a little bit of differing takes on this game. So we'll see which one comes out here.
Yeah,
And then,
absolutely.
oh, good.
No, I was gonna say absolutely. And the next game, I think, is a very exciting matchup. It has the potential to be one of those fun games back and forth, and that's Tennessee versus NC State. For me, obviously, this is Nico's first real test, and I think he'll be ready. And when I was watching him last week, he looked like a hyper talented version of Hendon Hooker from a few years ago. And when Hendon Hooker was, yeah, and when he was playing well 2 years ago, Tennessee looked very good. I mean, they knocked off a great Alabama team. They were well on their way to the playoffs before an upset loss at the end of the year, which also coincided with an injury. And Nico is, I mean, the guy just looks uber talented. You see it with him. He pops off the page. Like it's just a talented player who's going to have his first real challenge on the road. But I mean, I think he's going to be the X factor for this game and every game to come. And then the other player, James Pierce, over on the defensive side, is an absolute beast. He's going to be a top 10, maybe top 5 pick. He's going to be teeing off on NC State. And if they aren't ready, that game's going to get ugly really fast. I mean, Tennessee could easily lose this game still. I know they're -10. NC State does have a pretty good quarterback in McCall. Concepcion at receiver is very good and very productive. So it's not all Tennessee. This could easily go either way, but I just think the talent, the high-end talent on Tennessee, surrounded by just good players overall, is going to be what decides this game, and I think Tennessee wins.
Yeah, no, and real quick before I jump into my points, I'm pretty sure, you made great points with the Hendon Hooker comparison there. And when Hendon Hooker was leading that Tennessee team, how good and dangerous they were. And I think, that a few years ago when that was happening, I think that they were the number one team in the country when the inaugural college football playoff rankings came out for that year. They were the number one team because they had just knocked off Alabama prior to those rankings coming out, if I'm remembering correctly. So they were very good. And I think that, Nico can be equally as good, as Hendon Hooker, if not better. I mean, he's got the talent to certainly be better. So that's a really dangerous thing for, not just the rest of the SEC, but the rest of the country in general. And Josh Heupel is a fantastic coach, a great offensive mind. So that could be a dangerous pairing there. But, jumping into my points here, North Carolina State, they really struggled at times in week 1 against Western Carolina. However, with that said, I do expect that they're going to be much more prepared for this week's game. And I could even make an argument, not granted that's without seeing the product on the field, but that they were looking ahead to this game last week when they were playing Western Carolina, and that caused them to come out extremely sluggish and playing poorly, as a good amount of teams did in week 1, to be honest with you. So I'm not taking too much overreactions from North Carolina State's slow, sluggish looking week 1, truthfully. And like earlier, we touched on Texas, Michigan. I wouldn't be taking too much of it from Michigan's outlook, except for the fact that they have to play Texas in week 2. They don't get, another cupcake opponent or anything like that, which is why I think it's a bigger issue for them. But in North Carolina State, I fully agree. I think that they can absolutely compete in this game. I think Nico's an unbelievable talent for Tennessee. And I suspect that he performs the same in week 2 as he looked in week 1. He put up essentially like video game numbers, incredibly efficient, highly, highly talented player. I fully expect him to perform the same, not just in this game, but throughout his career, entirely. I think he's just that talented of a player. And I think Josh Heupel and Tennessee are going to put him in the best position to succeed. I would lean Tennessee here in this game, but taking the spread seems like it could potentially be a trap for me. I know it's only, it's 10 points, but North Carolina State's the number 24 ranked team in the country, Tennessee number 14 as of this recording. And so, it seems like it could be a trap to take Tennessee because of how good they looked in week one and how mediocre North Carolina State looked in week one. It just seems like North Carolina State, they're begging you to take that line of Tennessee minus 10, and then we get a great game on our hands. But again, for me, I'm suspecting a closely contested battle. Would lean Tennessee, would take Tennessee in the game, but I'm not confident enough to take them in the 10-point spread here.
Yeah, 10's a lot of points, especially for a ranked on rank matchup and also in North Carolina.
Yeah, and we only have 1 week of sample size games, right? Like we don't have 8-9 weeks to know like really who these two teams are yet. We think we know what they're becoming and what they're capable of, but we don't know yet fully what either team is.
All right. And then the next game we have here, and I'll let you kick things off, is, neither team's ranked. I think both teams are talked about quite a bit, and that's Colorado at Nebraska.
Yeah, this one's really intriguing to me, honestly, because we got this game last year, right? And it was a pretty entertaining game, if you remember. But when I look at this game, we saw Colorado against NDSU last week, and I think that we touched on this in our recap of that Colorado NDSU game because we had that on our list of games to talk about last week rather. Outside of Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, and potentially Dallin Hayden, like no one on this Colorado team puts any fright into opponents, in my opinion. And Hayden, truthfully, he's only a possibility, not due to anything in his control. I think he's a great athlete, the transfer from Ohio State, but it's because of the weakness that is Colorado's offensive line. Like Colorado's offensive line was an extreme weakness last year, and they look to be a weakness again this year. And Shedeur Sanders, I think, is great. Travis Hunter, we know, is great. And I think Dallin Hayden can be great. But again, he's behind a mediocre to poor offensive line, and so he's limited in what he can actually do. And, Colorado, again, they seem to be lacking in the same areas that plagued them last year. And I'm going to suspect that Nebraska will take significant advantage of that in a big way in this game. Like Nebraska, they always seem to kind of be the poster child team for, this is our year, and they fall short. And, they just could never get it done, especially under like Scott Foster. But I think this team with Dylan Raiola, the number one quarterback recruit, leading this team. I know it's just 1 week under his belt, so we're not trying to jump to too many conclusions, but I think his talent is off the charts. Personally, I do not see this game being close, and that's no disrespect to Deion Sanders, Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, Dallin Hayden, that Colorado team. I feel personally that this Nebraska team is going to be significantly better than them in this game, and I could easily see a double-digit victory in this game for Nebraska. Maybe I'm wrong and it's a closely contested game, but that's just how I see it playing out with the personnel on both teams. There's a few great players on Colorado, and outside of that, it really drops off. There's more promise with Nebraska's team in my eyes.
I think that's very bold. I have a similar outcome as far as who wins, but that's a lot of points. It might be a little too rich for my blood, but for me, this game really feels like a catapult game for whichever team wins. Colorado looked very suspect last week. Nebraska kind of has that kind of young upstart type of feel to it. Matt Rule teams historically kind of take a good jump in year two. So, I mean, whoever wins this game might have a lot of momentum and kind of answer some questions we have after week one. So, for me, this is Dylan Raiola's first home game against a marquee opponent. This game's going to have a lot of eyes on it. Last week, Colorado had millions of people tune in for their first game, and this matchup is much bigger. So all eyes on Nebraska, and I think they're going to answer. And one of the big reasons I think that's going to happen is, one, Colorado is not disciplined at all. They had attempted late hit after late hit, dumb penalties. The offensive line was once again a problem. Their defense was suspect to big plays, and I think that plays right into Raiola's hands. He's kind of a risk taker. He models his game after Mahomes. He slings it, and he's going to go for those big plays. And I just think that's going to be the difference in this game. I do think it's going to be close. I mean, Sanders and Jimmy Horn and Hunter, of course. I mean, those guys are going to keep them in it. But I just think over the course of a game, Nebraska just feels like a more cohesive team, and they're going to hit some more big plays, and that's going to be the difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm excited to see because these last two games we've had differing opinions on. So it's going to be really interesting to see, which one of us is right. Are we splitting it 50-50 or are we, one of us go 2-0 or 0-2? It's going to be interesting to see. As we wrap up here, we're going to talk about two kind of upset watch alerts games for this upcoming weekend. And I'll kick it off here. It's going to be Boise State taking on number 7 Oregon. And I think in the summer and even in fall camp, neither one of us thought we would be talking about this game. Like, I still fully believe in Dan Lanning as a coach, and I fully believe in Oregon's talent and roster as a whole. However, I was highly concerned with the performance I saw last week against Idaho, because if you look at it statistically, Oregon significantly outgained Idaho. Gabriel looked quite good in that game, and yet they won by 10 points. It makes absolutely no sense. You look at the stats between the two teams, and you would think that Oregon won that game by 35 plus points, and they won by 10. Like, again, Gabriel, he looked good in that game against Idaho. He threw for over 300 yards, but Oregon's offensive line looked very susceptible, and they could not run the ball to save their lives. And I know we touched on this in the recap earlier in the week when we put out that video. Oregon suffered some injuries on the offensive line in fall camp. But if you can't run the ball, I mean, this is something that has plagued another elite team like Ohio State over the last several years. Like, one of the easiest ways to mitigate a huge talent advantage, which Oregon has in this game against Boise State, is to make a team one-dimensional. If they take away the run game, or Oregon just can't run in general, not even anything to do with Boise State's defense, they just can't run, this game could get extremely interesting. And like Jonty, I believe is how it's pronounced for Boise State, he put up video game numbers last week. So I'm interested to see if that continues this week, because if he has any kind of performance like what he had in week 1, Boise State, we're very likely sitting here next week talking about Boise State pulling off the upset. Even if he doesn't perform anywhere close to what he did, if he just has like a normal game where he has 2 touchdowns or and 160 yards or something like that, it'd still be a fantastic game for him. But he had 6 touchdowns last week, put up video game numbers. Like, this is going to be a really interesting game that I'm going to have my eyes on. I don't think it starts until 10 p.m., but I'm going to be watching this game regardless. It's going to be a very interesting game. I suspect Oregon fixes the mistakes they allowed last week, because I think Dan Lanning and that program are too talented and he's too good of a coach. But if they don't, I mean, we could be discussing Oregon as a potential multi-loss team before that Ohio State showdown in October. I mean, if they have a performance like they did last week where they can't run the ball, they're one-dimensional, and they give up and are susceptible to some big plays or some trick plays, which Boise State will pull out. They will probably use some of that Idaho playbook that they pulled out in week 1. I mean, Oregon could be in some trouble. I suspect they get it right. I suspect they fix it, and I suspect Oregon wins this game, but I'll be interested to see, because we're going to find out pretty quick in this game, I think, which way it's going to go.
Yeah, and honestly, Oregon should win this game, and they should cover. But last week, I think, is giving everybody a bit of pause. Obviously, they looked very, I don't know, like no one saw that coming. And
yeah,
barely winning that week 1 game. I mean, a lot of teams struggled week 1, but their week 1 struggle stood out above a lot of others. That was very surprising. A team as talented as Oregon not imposing their will against Idaho's, I mean, it baffles my mind. And I think that's why with this particular matchup, we're calling it out on Upset Watch, because there might have been a blueprint kind of exposed last week already on how to beat or at least stay with Oregon. And I think the only way Boise State pulls this out is if they keep the game close, and that pressure on Oregon is just going to mount and mount and mount. And that's going to be a lot for them to handle mentally. Last week was a real challenge for them. And if that happens again, I think they realize they were lucky to get out of it last week. It's going to be trouble. And I think you called out the Boise State running back. I believe you said it's pronounced Jonte.
Yeah.
He was a beast. Now, obviously, he played against Georgia Southern. This is a much inferior opponent, and Boise State had trouble with that opponent. But this is essentially the ultimate overreaction, probably, from week one.
Sure.
But it does give me a feel that there's a puncher's chance, and that's all you can really ask for in an upset watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is probably that like quintessential overreaction, but given that performance against Idaho and how much they outgained them and only won by 10 points, it warrants discussion. And we both likely sit here on Sunday and Oregon, wins by a significant margin, and we're back to feeling good about Oregon and what we discussed in the preseason when we did our top 5 ranking. But until we see it, I've got major concerns, and you do as well. And, the last game we're going to talk about here for upset alert, and then we're going to give you our picks of the week before, wrapping up here, is going to be number 23, Georgia Tech taking on Syracuse. And I'll take this one. I'll let you go, second, and then you'll give your pick of the week. I'll give mine, and we'll wrap it up here. But Georgia Tech, they're favored in this game. Personally, I think I would favor Syracuse in this game. And it's not by a significant margin, but I'm going to favor Syracuse in this game. I think McCord, the transfer from Ohio State, looked good in week 1. And while he didn't fully succeed at Ohio State compared to what Ohio State fans and that program expect out of their quarterback and out of their team in general, I do think that he has the tangibles to be a very successful quarterback, especially at a program like Syracuse, where the expectations and the history and the tradition are not quite as stringent as at a place like Ohio State, where you are constantly under a microscope. And if you don't look like the best quarterback or the best player in the league at your respective positions, you are getting hammered on a weekly basis. And I do think that Georgia Tech could have a little bit of a hangover from that Florida State win. And obviously, we thought the Florida State win looked really good in week 1 when they were in Ireland. We were like, oh man, this Florida State team still could be decent. And Georgia Tech took it to them. Maybe Georgia Tech's significantly better than we thought. That still might be the case. But then we saw Florida State fall to a Boston College team that just tells you this Florida State team is broken right now. And maybe Georgia Tech broke them. Maybe they get the credit for doing that. I do think that they could have a little bit of a hangover, but I also think they could have a field day running the ball. Syracuse ranks 128th in run defense, and Georgia Tech is in the top 50 in terms of rushing the ball. So I would keep an eye on that as a potential game changer for Georgia Tech. But again, I'm taking Syracuse in this game, not by a significant margin. I don't feel incredibly confident about that, because if Georgia Tech is able to run the ball and run it very efficiently, that'll slow the game down for them and give McCord less time to win the game for Syracuse, which I think is going to be the key if Syracuse is going to win, is he's going to need to have a big game for them. But I'm going to lean Syracuse here ever so slightly.
Yeah, and I agree with that assessment. I do believe that Syracuse is going to pull this out in a tight game. But for me, it's just a perfect formula for a letdown game. Georgia Tech travels across the world, beats a top 10 team. I mean, they're feeling great. They have another game last week and they win again. Things are going well, but now they're going to Syracuse into the Dome, going against a team with a new head coach, a new quarterback. There just seems to be a good vibe for Syracuse, even though it's only been one game. And for me, Kyle McCord is going to be the key here. Now, he was, I mean, you could argue he was good enough to be a starting quarterback at Ohio State. Maybe he didn't have the mental makeup for it, but talent-wise, he was there. And I think for a team like Syracuse, and especially these two teams, he's a supremely talented prospect for this kind of matchup at the quarterback position. And I really do think that he found the right spot for him, both mentally and just fit.
Sure.
And I really think that's going to pay dividends for Syracuse this year. And, Syracuse is a +3 underdog at home. I just feel like you get that underdog vibe going on at home, new coach, new quarterback. You guys just won your first game. I think they're going to win outright, and I think that's something to keep an eye on. And I'm excited to see how Syracuse kind of builds from here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we wrap it up, let's hear your pick of the week. Then I'll give mine, and we'll close it on out.
Yeah, so my pick, I kind of hinted at it early on in our video here, but I have Texas -7.5. I think they're going to win by double digits. All things being equal, Michigan does not have the dogs to keep up offensively, and I think that's going to be the difference maker. So Texas -7.5.
Yeah, I like that pick. I went a slightly different way, but I hinted at it as well when I was going over this game. I'm taking Nebraska -7, and this might come back to bite me because again, I think very highly of Shedeur Sanders and Dallin Hayden and Travis Hunter, and I think Deion Sanders is a good, solid coach. I really do, but outside of those few that I mentioned, and you mentioned one or two other players for Colorado, there's really not anyone that scares you on that team. Like I mentioned in the preview of that game, and I think Dylan Raiola is a very, very talented quarterback. I think Matt Rule is starting to get his kind of thumbprint on this program, so to speak, and they're starting to get better and better, under his guys. And I fully expect Nebraska to win this game, and I think Nebraska could win pretty big by 10 or plus points. So Nebraska -7, hammering that for me is my go-to. So it'll be really interesting. Going to be a great weekend of games, as it always is. Love college football in general, so I know you and I are both excited to watch it. To anybody that listens to this podcast, we appreciate you guys. Any likes, subscriptions really helps out the channel. Comment, let us know your thoughts on everything we talked about, and then we'll see you guys next week with our next video.
All right. Thanks, everyone.